good.
All right. Well, I see many of you have joined us. I'm so happy you're here tonight. I know you're all excited because we have a very special guest here with us. We do want to be respectful of his time, so we don't want to delay too much getting started. But real quick, I wanted to just remind you to please leave your mics muted so there's no background noise in the recording. We would love it if you could turn your cameras on, but if you can't or don't want to, that's fine too. Ann and I will be taking turns presenting the questions that you sent in, and I have to tell you that we had such an overwhelming response that I had to consolidate several of the questions just to be able to try to get as many in as we can in a short hour. So with that, and after the Q&A, then I'll be announcing our next book. So I think without further ado, I will let Ann introduce our very special guest and get things rolling. Ann.
All right. Welcome to Girl Talk Apologetics with our guest author, J. Warner Wallace, author of Person of Interest. He is a Dateline featured cold case detective, author, speaker, senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and adjunct professor of apologetics at Talbot School of Theology, where I'm going to get my master's right now at Biola University, and also at Southern Evangelical Seminary, which is where Patty got her certificate in apologetics. So
very cool.
Welcome, Jim.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So I've got the first question here.
Okay.
And it's actually my question.
Okay.
So it seems like 30 years ago when I became a Christian, unbelievers would point out the many similarities, like, oh, all the world religions have a flood story or something like that, or they all have a golden rule. And that was kind of brushed off or denied as being valuable, or like aren't going to acknowledge that. What gave you the idea to consider similarities to actually be a valuable apologetic?
Well, I mean, a lot of this, I'm not an apologist, right? I'm just like all of you, just somebody who became a Christian. And I don't actually think there's a role for apologists. If I'm honest with you, it's not a biblically ordained role. You won't find the station or the office of Christian apologist anywhere in Scripture. You find pastors, you find evangelists, teachers. You don't find Christian apologists. Turns out that's the stuff that we're supposed to do. That's the stuff that's really our responsibility. It's part of being a Christian is to be a Christian case maker. So that's all I was. I knew that looking at this, if it was true, we have to account for certain things that are true about the world. One of which is that a lot of ancient mythologies have, rough outlines of who God would be. I never saw that as a hurdle. It wasn't like I became a Christian and I thought, well, how do I attack this apologetics question? It's how, as a non-Christian, do you sort through the mess of all these ideas about God and determine which idea is actually true? And so if you're going to do that, you're going to start with the mythologies and work your way through them to see which one's true, rather than start with, I'm a believer and I've got to defend Jesus against the mythology. So it wasn't done backwards. It was this that's just my story. That's how I approached it. And I never saw those as a problem, because the only reason why they're a problem is because if you haven't read them. If you've read them, you realize they're not much like Jesus, but they do have those 15 common. There's probably more. I probably could either narrowed it down to 10 or blown it up to 20 or 25. But then you have fewer and fewer deities that have those attributes, right? They become harder and harder to find. So I just tried to pick the 15. And people have asked me, why'd you stop at 15? I could have, easily done, 12, but 15 seemed like that was a kind of a good place to rest it. But that's really the only approach I took. I wasn't really trying to defend Christianity. I was just trying to see what's true.
All right. The next question was something that Hannah and Donna were both wondering about regarding chapter 9. Mm-hmm. The list of fathers of scientific disciplines includes unbelievers like Alan Turing and Charles Darwin. How did you define Christian in formulating this list? And considering that being raised as a Christian doesn't make you a true follower of Christ, do you have an idea how long the list would be if you included only scientists who were faithful Jesus followers?
Okay, so a couple of things about that. Darwin's not on my list. I refer to Darwin repeatedly, but I don't include Darwin on my list. If he's in there, it's going to be by the way, this happens all the time. You write a book, you spend a year with editors making sure they get all the nonsense out of the book, because sometimes it's a matter of, I literally have maybe 400 Word documents before I get to the final Word document. And what am I carrying over? What am I bringing back? I remember talking about that in April. So I look for the April Word document, pull it back out, put it in. So a lot of that happens. And you want to get all that nonsense out of the book. And then you discover a month in that someone discovers something that's so obvious. Like, how did we miss that? How did 5 sets of eyes looking at this for a year miss that obvious? It should not have been included. So you may very well find something that we need to edit, because I find that all the time. And then what we do is we say, okay, next edition, next printing. And by the way, printings are very small in this age, because it used to be you'd print a bunch of these and put them in a warehouse and have to sell them. Now we can almost print as you go. So I can probably, but that also means you've already got 100,000 copies out there that have the error in them. So there's the other problem, right? So you may find something that shouldn't be in there, but I never intended Darwin to be, if he's listed as the father of evolution on page 204, that's what you're saying. Let me take a look, because he shouldn't, I'm not listing him I never intended to list him as a Christian. But let's go back for another question on this. So the question then becomes, well, what if I only had if I only had the really devoted Christians in this Zoom call, who would I have to eliminate? I think probably a few of you. I mean, it depends on where I put the bar. You're serving at your church actively every week because you're really a devoted Christian. Not a lot of us do. I mean, where do I put that bar? Like what is it? So if you would at some point in your life claim a Christian identity in antiquity or in history, what do I do with that? So I've included. Now here's the bright news. The good news is that I have underestimated the number of believers on my list dramatically, because I'd have to have a proclamation at some point in writing somewhere in the history of that individual that says he's a believer. And for most of these scientists through history, I'm looking at where they are, right? They're in this region of the world in this century. And I know Christianity was crushing it in that region of the world in that century, but I can't find anywhere where someone publicly acknowledged their Christian faith. So I just leave them out to be safe. But I guarantee you, if you think there's some folks in there who shouldn't be, you maybe might be right. But there are way, way, way more people who aren't there who should be, because there's just no way to identify them as Christians. And by the way, their public identity online has been entirely scrubbed. Like you might have been listed on Wikipedia as a Christian 20 years ago, but if you're on Wikipedia still, you probably had that part scrubbed out. So it's really hard to capture all of the Christian believers. But yes, then the question becomes, well, what would I consider to be a true Christian? Could I be a Catholic and be a Christian? A lot of that list is Catholic.
Sure.
Oh, he's Amish. Well, what can you be
Well,
an
I
Amish
think
person
then
being on
maybe,
that list? I mean, so there's the problem. It's like, where do you? But to be honest with you, there are lots of folks who would say that they are Buddhists, and there's a very rich history of Islam in the sciences and of other, but I don't know how much in or out of those worldviews those folks are.
right.
So I think in the end, you definitely are getting a picture that's not as precise as a list, because there's a lot more that should be on, and probably a few of those that should come off, but there's just no way to know.
That's
I
a
think that was
very
helpful.
good insight. Yeah.
Yeah. Anne, you want to go on to the next
I
one?
think if anybody has issues, they can write to his publisher.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of those, those things will be now. As far as I'll check the Darwin, because I don't want that on there.
Sure.
I mean, he's the father of evolution, but he's not a Christian.
Right.
I've included, I think, 6 fathers of evolutionary sciences that are Christians, but they were either writing alongside Darwin or writing in opposition to Darwin. So,
okay. So question 3, both
Mhm.
Katie and Katrina had a question. What was the turning point for you to become a believer? Was it discovering the red zone evidence described in this book, or was it the trustworthiness of historical evidence as described in Cold Case Christianity?
Yeah, so I'm a cumulative case guy. I know there's a whole line of apologetics that is called cumulative case apologetics, and I guess I'd fall in that, because that's just the way we make cases generally. It's never any one thing. It's going to be the entirety of things, and so I'm never usually, when I'm writing a chapter and I'm doing the research, I got to the point where I exhausted everything I could do in that chapter, and then we wrote it. So if there was another like a rabbit trail I could investigate, I wanted to do that before, because we're making a cumulative case. And so you want every little piece in there. I'm writing a book right now where it's like taking me forever, because if there's been a study out there that's in this area, I want to at least read it. So because I'm making a cumulative case, I might find another little nugget. But the problem with taking an cumulative case approach is that there's never one thing that convinces you. There was not one thing that convinced me, largely because I wouldn't trust myself on any one thing. So I guess it gets to a point where and this is probably, you probably see this too, right? Like where your kids will come home and they'll make an excuse for why they're out late. And at some point you just realize, okay, yeah, good. I believe you. like they're just giving this thing and this and this and this. And at some point you're like going, okay, yeah, I believe you. And it's not like any one of those things. It's just that you've already given me like 5 ways to defend this. So I'm good. And so that's kind of what happened to me, is you get to a place where you're just, okay, I mean, how much more do I really need? And then you feel like you're in, and you're not just like dogpiling. So
I think
Sounds like it's more like tipping the scale.
yeah, you're tipping the scale. But and what we discover with jurors is that we present all kinds of small little minutia, because after you do the case and you interview the jurors, you're just amazed at what stupid thing it was that convinced juror number 7. You're thinking, wow, that's what it was. Because we'll ask him, what did you think was the most persuasive piece of evidence we presented? We want to know too. We know it's a cumulative case, but we know there's scales of how much is persuasive. And we're just curious for the future, like what persuaded you? And when someone will say, well, yeah, it was this little thing that we almost didn't even include. Well, then you're thinking, wow, that's why you include all that stuff, because you just never know. And by the way, that little thing took a day to get into evidence. And I'm sure that the other 11 jurors were like bored to tears. That didn't mean anything to them. They're like, why are you, and you hear that a lot. Like it was overkill. You guys overkilled it. We were done a month in. It's like, this took forever and we were already done. Why'd you do that? Because we don't know who juror 7 is. Who's the one that's going to say, I needed that extra little piece over there? So we kill it. And then, you got everybody.
All right. I and several others in the group had trouble tracking the distinction between clear and cloaked prophecies in chapter 4, especially when elements were listed in both categories. For example, the unblemished Passover lamb whose bones will not be broken on page 60. I think that was a cloaked. And then on page 61, it says executed without bones broken as a clear prophecy. So can you just help us better?
When you first said that, I thought that's got to be a mistake that's in the because that to me is a cloaked piece of evidence. And so if it was ever on a clear side, that's another one of those things we need to fix, because what we're looking at is stuff that you wouldn't know until after the execution. You wouldn't know until after he dies that way that it fits him. That's the button on his shirt. I think I used a button in the book to argue for that kind of thing. So yeah, so again, the definition is really straightforward. Then of course you realize too that there's going to be a scale of whether you think something is clear or cloaked. You might say, well, that's like on a scale of 1 to 10, that is a 10 in terms of clear evidence. And others would say, well, no, on a scale of 1 to 10, it's like a 6. Okay, well, I might still include it, but that means that lots of folks would say it shouldn't be on there. So it's that every piece would be debatable. But in the end, you can take a minimalist approach. So this is what I love about this approach, is a cumulative case approach means that if you took half of everything I put on any page out, you still got a really strong case. So if we thought, well, I'm not quite sure that I wouldn't have included that in the clear, I would put that as cloaked. Okay, fine, take it out. Take out half more. You're still going to have a really strong case, because that's why we build robust cumulative cases, right? Because we want to overwhelm the jury. So that no matter how you cut this, no matter what you think you want to throw out, you're still stuck with it. Does that make sense? But yeah, that's one that I think if it's on both lists, it shouldn't be. And I would put it cloaked.
Okay.
Because it requires an execution first to see if his bones are broken.
Right. That's what we were thinking. That's why we were confused. So
right.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. So it's not unusual. So here's what I discovered in this book. Everyone in Frank Turek said, hey, you should probably just write 10 books. Like a publisher's going to give you a deal for 10 books, right? Well, so every chapter, it could have been a book, because there's so much content in each one that you could have really mined it out. And if you did that, you'd have a year's worth of editors, making sure that thing is really good. The problem when you're taking this 30,000 foot view is that it's overwhelmingly open to problems. I don't know if you actually went online to see that there's far more pages in the endnotes and far more words in the endnotes than there are in the book. I can only imagine and by the way, those people don't get one editor for the endnotes. I think if there are going to be bigger errors in the book, they're probably going to be in the endnotes because I only have one set of eyes on those. And then who knows if they're catching everything. I bet it's probably poor grammar in there. There's probably lots of little things in the wrong place. What can you do? It's just
We
the
love
nature of
the
it.
endnotes. Endnotes are gold. Like that's
Yeah, they can be. Yeah, they can be. But already I can tell you this next book, it'll be probably 3 times as large in the endnotes. Then you got to figure out what do you do with that? You can't print it. It's too expensive and it's boring. And I don't want to put them at the end of the page. I don't believe in that. I mean, academic books are really important and nobody reads them except for people like me who read them to write this kind of book.
right.
Then you're not going to read the academic version because it's really boring. So that's why, you have to try to make this accessible, but that means you're going to end up making tons of mistakes. But anyway.
Okay, so this is a question both Kristen and I have.
Mhm.
She was very interested in the red zone. What aspects of our culture might God be using as a red zone to prepare for our second coming? Now, granted, this is very speculative, but in the red zone methodology, is it a methodology useful as a predictive tool or only analysis and hindsight?
Yeah, no, it's not a predictive tool. So I think, you can always say that you can argue, well, every time I see this, it typically leads to that, but not always. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Not every heroin addict I've ever interviewed started off smoking dope, but not everyone who smokes dope ends up using heroin. So you can't always, now looking backwards, you can see that this is one of the factors that led to this mess. And that's why it's excellent for doing things forensically after the fact, but it's
So
not good for doing
correlated.
things predictive. Yeah. So that's what people will say all the time. And I think that God knows that. And that's why scripture is written that way, to be watchful or to be prepared, or to stop trying to write red zones for the future. Because that's, by the way, if I was really good at that and could do that, we wouldn't be talking to you right now because I'd be wealthy because I would have done it with the stock market. And then I would have,
Right.
so that's why we can't do that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think in the end that it is a hindsight tool. It's not a foresight tool. That's the difference.
All right.
All right, next question is from Hannah. She says, you were a homicide detective and that allows you great wisdom in answering questions critically. How can we develop good researching skills and critical thinking skills to understand claims against Christianity?
Well, I think part of the problem is that we don't develop the skill set in church. So here's what I would say. Everything you have a level of commitment toward requires testing. Tests actually measure the level of commitment that you have. So if I teach a class tonight and I don't have any tests, no papers to write, no tests to take. Well, some people will think, should I even go to class tonight? I'll just skip tonight. I'll go next week because I don't have to be that committed to something there's no test for. And once I start, having tests, well, now suddenly that's a whole nother level of commitment. And the more dramatic the commitment, the more dramatic the tests. As a matter of fact, if I wanted to determine what it is you're committed to, I simply need to ask myself, well, where is it in your life that you are all studied up and ready to take the test? Because that's the thing you're most committed to. So for a lot of guys, we can make the case for whether, the Chiefs or the Eagles are going to win this weekend, and we could do it with 15 points. I can tell you who they drafted last year, who they're going to draft next year, why the window is so short to get into the Super Bowl, but why that left tackle is not going to be able to stop that edge rusher. I could do all that with you. And that just shows you that I'm prepared to pass a test in that category. But that just means I'm really committed to that. And you might ask, well, why are you so committed to that? So when we say we're committed to Christ, the question I have is, are you prepared to pass any tests? It used to be that we would have months before we even get you baptized because we would catechize you for all those months. And then once you passed the catechism, you were eligible to be a Christian. So there were a lot of tests because the commitment was high. We have no tests in the church. All we have to do now is say, I'm in. It's like saying, I'm going to attend class. Okay, you're done. You get the master's. You get the master's right now because you said you wanted to attend. That's not the way to. No wonder we're unthoughtful.
I need to say I'm so convicted. I'm teaching this 10-week course on the big idea of Christianity, and one of the selling points was there's no homework or tests. And I'm just like, oh my gosh. So guess what? Tons of people showed up.
Right. Tons of people. That's the church. It's an inch, an inch deep and mile wide.
Oh,
So that's what happens. Look, what if you said there's going to be a lot of tests, but you only got 3? Well, at least you know you have 3 committed Christians. Now you don't know what you have. And that's the problem, right? So we don't have tests in the church. We don't require much in the church. And that's why people say, well, how do I get to this? But it turns out that all the stuff that you just went through, probably you should have gone through before you said, I do. But we didn't do it that way. We just jumped in. And so now we have a lot of people in the church who don't know truth from error or even how to discover it. Like no one's walked them through the process to discover it. And that's why we are the most unthoughtful, silly group. If you don't think we are, just try to grow a big social media platform and then watch what Christians say on it. So I get to do that every day. It's pretty irritating. I block probably as many Christians as I do atheists because we say such stupid things that are unthoughtful. And so there's the problem, right? So I would say that, yes, we all should be better critical thinkers, but it doesn't, you have to be a detective to do that. If you're a mom, you're probably if you've got teenagers, you're probably a pretty good critical thinker, right? So it's not like you have to have detective skills to do that. Here's the thing, is that you're actually a really good critical thinker in lots of other areas. You just haven't applied it to your Christian faith. So it's not a matter of teaching people how to think, it's teaching people to think more about Christianity. So I know that if we're going to be like, we have to be able to pass tests, and the most formidable and the most important foundational place to pass the test is worldview, because it controls everything else you do. So we should, first of all, and that's the foundation. The next one should be marriage and child rearing. And then you can look to things like calling and duty and work and things like that. They're way, way down the food chain. The first one's got to be, but here's what we do. We can't be successful at work unless you can pass all the tests. So that's probably where everyone's really good. And in their profession, they're really good critical thinkers because they have to be to survive. But that foundational thing that really controls how you work, you've never even thought about being critical there. And that's probably where the church is more, that's broadly speaking where the church is. And so, for me, I get frustrated with it. But the reason why we have authors who make money writing books on progressive Christianity or on all kinds of heresies is because no one did the stuff they were supposed to do to make that book irrelevant. We wouldn't need those books. But we don't have people who have thought critically about their faith. So now we have a bunch of folks who have to be we have kind of like write the ship books, but the ship never should have turned over. And so that's where we are. Makes sense?
yeah.
Sure does.
Mind-blowing.
What we're trying to do really as we get older, like you write books in the age in which you're the author. So when I was in my 50s, it was fine to write books about the case for, an aggressive case for this, case for that. As you get older, you kind of move into wisdom books, right? Because now you're the old man. I don't like it, but that's just the way it is. Well, that's true for all of us. As we get older, we can actually now have something my partner I was at dinner with him the other night, and he was bummed because he's going to turn 70. And he's like thinking, well, what do I do? He's like, he's on the back 9, probably on the back 3, looking at the clubhouse. He's like, it's really close. And he's like, I was thinking about it. I said, well, if you think about it, you got grandkids you love, but they're all like 2 and 3 years old right now. They won't remember you at all. The years they're going to remember with you are the next 10.
This reminds me, in a class taught by Dr. Kyle Strobel at Talbot, he actually talks about this, and he wrote about this in his book, The Way of the Dragon or The Way of the Lamb. And it's about power. And he's like, you go to Christian conventions, and who do you have up there? The young, hip, charismatic speakers. Where are all the old people, the ones with wisdom that can tell us what we need to know about this life, this walk?
Well, here's the problem. If they're wise, they know better than to get on that stage, because that celebrity is one of the things that wisdom tells you to shun. So that's why I've stopped. I've canceled almost every speaking event. There's a point at which you realize that's not. If you've all watched what happened to Robbie, none of that would have happened to Robbie if he hadn't chased celebrity, and he chased it without any limitations. His staff actually helped him chase it. And I've said this before, you only commit murders or crimes for 3 reasons. It's money, sex, and power. And celebrity is the power side. Now, what I've discovered is if you're willing to scratch one of those 3 itches, you will scratch the other 2. And people might have said, well, you need to be, careful about your being around women, or you need to be careful about how you use money. But nobody said you needed to be careful about the growth of a celebrity. But you can't grow celebrity without also growing the other 2 temptations. They are all connected. So that's the kind of wisdom that once you know that, you're like, well, wait a minute, I'm speaking 50 times this year. Not anymore. Because if you're wise, you realize that that whole culture of speakers on a stage is dangerous. And the church was never like that. The church was never probably bigger than the size of a house. The entire book of Acts, there was no 300-person church in the book of Acts. It may have happened within a century of the book of Acts, but the book of Acts was the churches were the size of your organic extended family. If you were going to have a family reunion, you would invite how many people? Maybe 100, but probably less. So say you invited 50 cousins, aunts, uncles. How many is that going to be? 50? 40 to 50? And how many do you really know well? 20? Well, that was the size of the church. Every little church was that size. And that means you really can't escape. I mean, that's the kind of one-on-one discipleship that occurs without having to have a big speaker at a conference on a stage. That's where it was happening. The catechism was happening in one-on-one, like your dad would teach you how to do it, or your uncle, or your grandfather. And we've lost that. And so part of it for me is like, as I get older, I realize, okay, I can't contribute to it and then bellyache about it. So I'm probably going to have to make a decision about what the future looks like.
Right.
Now I'm going to be with Kyle's dad, Lee, on Friday night. We're going to be in Palm Springs for a conference. But I mean, I do. I mean, it's local. I'm doing less and less of these. I won't leave my family to go do a conference anymore. So
Wow.
she has to come with me, or I'm not going. So
That's
just because
awesome.
I just don't want to be away from Susie. So I just don't want to be miserable.
Donna says you should put
it's
out
selfish, really.
All right.
So
Donna says you should put out a test for each book you write so we can see if we understand it and know it. Well, that's why he does in the video and in the study guide and stuff like that. And that's why we have questions each week to make sure you're paying attention.
Right. And that's when I write my own study guide. So when I wrote the study guide for Person of Interest, if you read it, it's full of fill-ins and questions, and the videos for this are really good. Not because I did them, because we got dumbed into a lucky production company that wanted to go all out. So they're like little mini movies. They built sets, they did all kinds of crazy stuff, and they animated the entire thing. So all the illustrations come to life. So
Oh, wow.
yeah, so it's worth just kind of looking at it at least, and then you'll see that experience through the study guides is much more like a testing experience.
Okay. Okay, so Andrea has a question regarding this. Looks detailed. Oh, yes, this was a very good question.
Okay.
On the sidebar on page 173, says that Christianity grew not as a result of violence, but as Christ followers advancing education across the globe, putting kind of a positive spin on education by Christians. She doesn't think this is the case when it came to our Canadian residential schools. I don't know if you're familiar with all that. And there's been a lot of really bad press that the church, particularly Catholic Church, used religion education to subdue and assimilate the First Nations people in Canada, resulting in trauma and abuse. Can you maybe speak to that? How would you respond if someone came with you with that?
Well, I would look, there's in every single positive venture, there's always a significant percentage of negative. I mean, there is. No one's clean. The United States is certainly not clean. Christianity is not. Why? Because there are these nasty little things called humans that actually exist within the worldview. I think it'd be one thing if we said, hey, we know that God's angels have done all these bad things, or that God actually appeared and did those bad things. And what we're saying is humans who claim to know what God says to do did those things. Oh, really? Well, good luck with that. That means we're going to have a bunch of stupid, right? Because humans do a bunch of stupid things. I'm sure we could say that for the large part, your country is, we have a tendency to believe that America has stood for good things. Well, we know there's a bunch of bad things that are also part of that. I'm sure that Canada has its own, sordid history as well. Everything has got a sordid history because it involves humans. But here's what happens is we look at the literally millions and millions of people who actually got an education at all because of the growth of Christianity. The people who were actually educated in Christian institutions, so they had enough education to criticize the institution of Christianity, had that because they were standing on, they were sitting in God's lap and slapping him in the face. Now, there's going to be a percentage of those folks who in Christianity who are going to do terrible things. They did. So I guess I could have said, well, Christianity has done all this, but I don't even know what the percentage would be. If the percentage is, 98% of the history of Christianity related to education is this great thing. But I have to remember, it won't just be in Canada, by the way. It'll be all over the world where Christians have abused that mandate and have done something reprehensible. Because anywhere there are humans, there'll be a percentage that'll do something stupid. So there's no doubt that when someone makes an overarching statement, there's no doubt that that's going to be overlooking percentages. That now the argument is, well, yeah, but actually it's not a 98-2. It's actually, you're wrong. It's 60% evil and only 40% good. Well, I don't think that's the case at all. And I think we can make an argument for that. What percentage of it is good? But then the question becomes, do I need to have a footnote, except for and list all the places? I'm not sure I could identify all the places that stupid Christians have done stupid things because there's just too many stupid places. So I just don't know what you do with that. But here's my point is that in the book, we're talking about the reason why we know is the people, by the way, who are making the complaint about the impact that Christianity had on education are people who got educated largely in what were once Christian education institutions. So I think the impact is just too hard to deny. Now, there's no doubt, though, that there are all kinds of Christians who took that mandate, took that calling they thought was a calling, and they abused it. So there's no doubt about that. And that's why I write a book like this, because you can find that other book about how Christians have done things wrong. That's everywhere. You can find that by flipping on Google impact of Christianities of Christians right now. Just Google impact of Christians. I bet most of the responses in the first 10 pages of the Google search will be negative. That's why I felt like we needed to say, well, hold on here. It turns out that actually it's not as bad as you think it is. It's actually just the opposite. But of course, there are going to be examples of terrible things. Now, and the problem is that when you write a book like this, you run the danger of minimizing the bad things. And I don't want to do that. I'm not looking to minimize where we've gone off the rails. But at the same time, because here's what happens. When you have something, you ever see the Book of Eli?
Yes.
It's a movie. Okay, it's a great movie, right? So a movie where this guy ends up having a copy. It's a dystopian future. He's got a copy of the Bible, and his arch nemesis, the enemy, wants the book. He wants the book because what's he want to do with it? He wants to leverage it for power. He wants to control people with it. He sees it as the greatest force for control. If he could just have the book, and of course, I won't tip it away. You have to watch the movie, but that's really the struggle between Eli, who has the book, and his enemies who want to get the book from him. So it's clear that anytime you have something that has great power, people will leverage it for evil. So I think that the problem is, I think what we would say is that behavior consistent with the teaching of Jesus? I don't think much of Nazis, but I haven't given up on Germans. So I think part of it is, could I say, well, yeah, really, if you are German, the percentage of people who are Nazis is so high that I could not think well of any German? Or is it just that this is what happens when power runs sideways?
Right.
Probably in any country. It's probably
Patty, is that Augustine who said, don't judge a philosophy by its abusers? Or
Yeah, never judge a philosophy by its abuse.
Yeah. And so I think that's the problem. Yeah. So there's no doubt. And so what I would say is that all that stuff, I'm sure, happened because it happened here in America with the native population in America. It happened in lots of places, I'm sure. But I don't think but if I removed the catalyzing force that would allow for that kind of abuse, I don't know where we would be. Because if you look at the history of, I don't think, did I say this in the book? We did a database search of all of the universities. More universities have been started and closed by Christians than have been formed by all the other groups combined. That when I saw that, I couldn't believe it. So that's just, we just have it, but it shouldn't surprise you when the chief mandate of Jesus was not to go make, converts. It was to go make disciples, comma, teaching them all that. Oh, so teaching is part of the mandate. So yeah, so if you've got a view where your God leaves and says, before I go, here's your job, teach people, you're probably going to get educational institutions.
All right. Well, we have some ladies in our group who are very artistic or who are interested in art, and several who really appreciated the detailed graphics you provided to help us visualize the concepts that you wrote about. Would you please describe the process you used to create all the illustrations and tell us approximately how long it took to create an illustration with well over 100 faces and no apparent duplication, like the one on page 195?
It takes forever. And when I was doing it, typically what I'm doing, I asked Zondervan for I think 2 years to build the stage presentation. So what happens is, when I did Cold Case, I was teaching that material to students for probably about 8 years. And Sean McDowell says, you should write a book about this. So I already had these visual presentations I was doing for students with the chain of custody and all these other things, right? And so it was not hard to create a visual book. Also, it wasn't hard to write the book because you now had years to present the material and work out the bugs. Like it wasn't just that I knew the chain of custody. I knew how to present it in a way that was quick, compelling, evokes a decision. You don't know that then if you write a book first. So when I did God's Crime Scene, I only had probably maybe half that material that I had really spoken a lot about publicly. So that meant when I did the other half, and then a year later, I started now I'm creating media presentations for the public. I'm like, oh, there's such a better way to say this. I wish I would have included that. Now we're doing a 10th anniversary edition of Cold Case. It comes out in September. And we went from 90 illustrations to 390 illustrations. It looks much more like Person of Interest. And a lot of the stuff that I've learned, even since I wrote Cold Case 10 years ago, we've gone back and rewritten into Cold Case because I think it works better. So you learn as you go. So what we did is that, yeah, I had a year, and all of those illustrations you see are actually color images that are in the video. If you've ever seen in my stage presentations, they're online. You can see these online. You'll see that those same illustrations are in the screen behind me, but they're in color. So then once you got those in color, you created them in color, and that's all in Photoshop. I'm creating them in Photoshop. I'm looking for images of faces. Those are actually the faces that historically have been attached to each person, even though nobody can know for sure in some of those what they look like because they're too ancient. But there's then one popular version of, I don't know, Papias pops up, and you see that all over the place. Okay, so I just grabbed that. I'll use that as Papias. I'm sure that's not what he looked like. But I did that for every single person in the book, all the scientists too. So you got all those and made all those. It took me about 2 years. And while I was building it, my wife thought I was crazy because you start off, you find the face of the scientist, and then then I made a base in Photoshop and a bust, and I took his face and I put it on the bust so that it looks like it's on a bust in the Hall of Fame. And then I push it out where I want. I render it out as a PNG. It's got a clear background. I put it in the PowerPoint so it comes in one at a time. So everyone fades in, it's animated. It's not just an image, it's an animated image. So these are all clear background PNGs. Let's see. Oh, heck, I can share a screen. So let me just show you. So then what I did was, let's see what time is it before I go any further, before I get too much in the weeds here. Yeah, we got time. Okay. So let me just go to one of these presentations here real quick. Person of interest. Okay, so I'll even try to show you what the Photoshop looks like. But so this is, let's go to science, for example. Okay, so I'm going to share a screen with you real quick. I'm just going to share the construction screen of the scientists here. So let me just grab it here real quick. Okay, so let me share this screen. Screen one. Okay. So can you see my construction screen of my PowerPoint here? I think you
Yes.
can, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So each one of these little okay, that's actually the burning fuse. I'm just trying to move some things around here to show you how I built this. I'm pretty sure that each one of these, yeah, is probably going to be, come on now. Yeah. Okay. So you can see when I touch it that this little feather is a clear background PNG. See, I moved it over to the center. So I create it in Photoshop and then I render it out as what's called a PNG, and that has a clear background. So now I can move it over and it doesn't. So now when it animates, it's going to animate through one at a time. Now, when it gets time to draw this, I simply I've already created it. I've created it in color. So now all I have to do is just put a trace over it and ink it. And so that's what we did with the illustrations. But that meant though I had to create all of these in color first. So if you look down here, there's a lot of slides in a presentation like this, right? I mean, this is all just getting through the fuse. And then here we go.
I'm just thinking about in the old days where you had those clear overhead sheets. You would
right.
have to lay them over one
Yeah.
over.
Well, here, for example, I created every one of these individually, and then I put them together so you can see them. Each one of these is an individual image.
Yikes.
Yeah. And when I was doing this, trust me, my wife thought I was nuts. But I just want you to see, you create, and this means you have to have your list of scientists, and then you have to go out and find images for them. And then you got to put them in this thing. And then when it animates, I'll put it all back together here. It's all it's going to do is this one little thing here. Let me, I can't even reach up there, unfortunately, because of the stupid animation pane. Here we go. Okay. So when you're trying to play it, let's see. Come on now, Jim. What am I doing wrong here? They just changed.
What program are
PowerPoint.
you using?
This is PowerPoint. So it's in PowerPoint, but it is, let's see. Oops, go back to the slide. There's that slide. Can I play from there? PowerPoint's changed the way I just updated mine to Windows 11. Have you guys done that? And I tell you what, I'm sorry I did, because it's so hard to figure out. But anyway,
well, this kind of actually leads to the next question. Kristen and Ann, Kristen and Ann, I'm Ann. We both, it appears that you love doing research. Is that true? And is that just based on being a detective, a cold case detective? So you're a natural researcher. And do you do all your own research, or do you have help?
Sometimes I have help. I had help for this book. This book wouldn't have gotten written if it wasn't for the pandemic. We had the pandemic year, and then we were all stuck. All the road stuff got canceled, so I was home for a while. And I had 2 research assistants, just folks who wanted to help. They're mentioned in the front of the book in the credits. Those guys really did a lot of heavy lifting. But then, you have to go a little further. So I asked, okay, I want you to find every attribute of Osiris, and I want you to list it for me. Or I want you to find this is where you have to trust. I want you to give me a preliminary list. I had a list I started with. It was probably a tenth of what we ended up with of scientists who claimed a Christian identity. And I need to know, and you got to confirm it. It's got to be in writing somewhere. Number one, what's their name? When do they live? What country do they live in? What denomination are they? So you need to know. And what is the scientist specialty? Are they the founder or father of a discipline? And have they ever received an award? And if so, what? And that was the assignment. And so you have to trust that. That's why I know there's going to be a lot of stuff we didn't get. Right. Now, of course, I get the list and I get to say, well, no, I'm not including that guy. I'm not including that guy. But when someone gives you a list of 950 scientists, I'm sure I missed somebody. But I also know that list should be twice as deep. And it's just not, because there's no way to know. If you're somebody like who is not written about Jesus, and now 500 years go by, will I ever find anything to identify you as a Christian? Maybe. You could say you can get clues. Dad is a minister, son is a minister. He's probably a Christian, but I couldn't be sure, so I left him out. So there's a bunch of those, so that's the thing where you're just not quite sure who's who in the zoo. So yeah, I love, you have to do a lot of research. Our cases sometimes take 3 years before we even write the first search warrant. We're just collecting for the search warrant. So the search warrant will be evidentially robust, so the judge will sign it. And we also don't want anyone to know we're working the case until we knock on his door. So a lot of the stuff we're doing is just, kind of behind the scenes and collecting data, because all criminal trials are, I know people who believe that all we need to do is preach the gospel and that God's spirit then does the rest. You probably have seen that, right? Is that our job is not to convince anybody. Our job is just to preach the gospel. And I've even heard evangelists say, as I'm preaching the gospel, I look out in the audience and I can see that some folks are already ready to accept the gospel. They're leaning in, they're interested. And others are like, whatever. And I can tell that, and I don't know how that works. That's not my job. God does that. My job is just to preach the gospel. Could you imagine going to a criminal trial and you said, I'm a prosecutor, but my job is just to do the opening statement. I don't have any obligation to show any evidence for this or do a closing or a rebuttal. I'm just going to do the opening statement. And some of these jurors are going to decide that it's true and some are not. That's not my job. That's just, okay. That just to me seems ludicrous. So I think that we present the gospel, we have to be ready to present all the reasons why the gospel is true. So we ought to be researchers from the beginning, right? We should have data. We should know. If I'm writing a book, I can't write a book about my opinions. You don't care about my opinions. You shouldn't. You want to know, is this true or not? So that means I got to do a lot of data. So like I'm doing a book right now on 15 things about people you learn, 15 life lessons that you learn from working deaths. So it's kind of like death lessons. Okay. I'm calling it 15 to life. And it's just 15 things you've learned. Now, what's great about it is it'll make a case for biblical anthropology. So in the end, it's a case for Christianity from the nature of humans. But these are things about humans you'd only learn if you work homicides, or at least they become obvious. But if I want to say, well, okay, it turns out that one of the things that is striking for human flourishing is humility. It is the solution for every problem in the world. It's amazing. And if you've ever looked at the studies for humility, humility has incredible power over the human species. But how did you know that? I got to read the studies. I got to find the studies. I got to go through all the studies. So I want to say, for example, that people who are humble do better on tests and have higher grades and are better at discerning the lie from the truth. That's true, actually, statistically. But if it were for me to say that humility leads to better grades, well, yeah, because if you think about it, it makes sense, right? If you're humble and open to being taught, you're teachable, you're likely to learn something. But it turns out that people actually do better on tests for logical reasoning if they first display the attributes of humility. But I only could say that if I can find the study. I found it by accident. But that's because I'm just digging through the evidence to see what studies have ever been done in the last 20 years on humility. There's a bunch. And that is going to end up being probably 2 days of work. And it's going to end up being maybe 3 lines in a paragraph. Humble people are A, B, and C. But it took me like 2 days to figure out that they were A, B, and C. So that means you're going to spend a ton of time, way more time researching than you are writing. And so if you're writing this kind of book, if you're writing fiction, that's entirely different. But if you're writing this kind of book, that you got to be somebody who's committed to research.
All right, our next question comes from Gretchen, and she said, I often experience a crushing weight when I observe large crowds of people and consider how many of them are headed to a godless eternity. How do you process the heaviness of the lostness of such a large amount of people around the globe who have a misunderstanding of who Jesus is, reject him, or have not yet heard of him?
Well, okay, so I'm trying to figure out how to say this without sounding like a complete jerk. But I'm probably not good at that. I'm probably not a good person to ask that question because I work homicides. The first rule of homicides is you have to draw a very tight circle around the people for whom you are willing to cry. My circle is very tight. My wife's in it. My kids are in it. My dog Bailey, who passed last week, she was 14 years old. She was in it. My cat Simba is not in that circle. Okay. So you have to have a tight circle. And if you have a tight circle, well, then you can work any homicide. Oh, a 6-year-old is shot in the forehead by his father. I can work that. I mean, I could work, my cousin getting killed. I could work that. Not in my circle. Now that sounds terrible. I get it. But that's really, in some ways, I mean, I think what God's calling me to do is to open the circle up. I think most of scripture is about us opening up our circles. But someone's going to have to work these kinds of cases. And I've been at cases where people's circles is way too big and they can't do the job. They end up leaving. They end up retiring on a disability. They end up not working the case that night when you needed them. And I just don't think, you want somebody who's actually going to be, oh, I'm okay with this. Oh, we need to move this boy over here. I can do that. You need to lift this up. I can do it. You need to pull his shirt off. I can do that because my circle is really tight. So that's the kind of thing I think that for me. So when I look at like what God is going to do, there's going to be a lot of folks that you're going to be surprised are actually there. And a bunch of folks you're going to be surprised aren't. That's just the problem. It's just what God does. So I just kind of release that. I release all of that. And I think when you tighten a circle to work these kinds of cases, you have to release a bunch of stuff. You just cannot allow yourself. Now, my circle is so tight that I can cry like this for my kids or my wife. So I've just invested all of that emotional energy on the few people that are in the circle, right? So there's a danger because you are then hypersensitive to the folks who are in the circle and pretty insensitive to the people who are out. There's the problem, right? I don't think we're called to live that way. So that's why I say you're probably asking the wrong person, is because that's just, and I don't think you can develop that. You just have to be that way or you're not that way. So I don't think it's not a, I mean, when I was 13, my dad showed me the first homicide that he had worked. It was 1974. And it was a multiple murder in our city. And it was on 16 millimeter film. He put it on the projector and threw it against the wall. And I thought, I'll never be able to do this kind of work. But by the time I was 20, I was like, yeah, I could do that. So I think it's just, for me, I had to release that to what God's going to do. We will be pleasantly surprised though, that a lot of the folks we thought weren't going to be there probably are. We might be disappointed because we're not there. So I just think, it's one of those things you have to kind of release.
I think we can appreciate that.
So it's just, I'm not a good person to ask for that. I think that there's probably a better sounding answer than the one I just gave.
No, I think that's fair. And it behooves us to realize that we're all wired differently because,
right.
But at the same time, I can't think which Corinthians first. Maybe it talks about Paul asking us to enlarge our hearts, like enlarge your heart.
No, there's no doubt that tight circle thing is not, it's not healthy. And people, as there's another chapter I'm writing in the book, that the people who have enlarged that circle, it turns out friendship and community, we are wired for community. And every metric upon which you measure thriving or flourishing is actually better for people who have deep, close friends. They live longer, they have better physical health, they have better mental health, they have higher incomes. I mean, it's crazy, the impact of opening yourself up to relationships. And that makes sense because we're designed in the image of the one relational God. There is no God like ours that is that is triune in nature, that is love, because he has always been in a state of that loving relationship. Like Augustine said, the lover, the beloved, and the spirit of love between them. So you can't say that Allah is love. You could say he is the creator of love, or he's capable of love, or he learned to love, but he had to have something to love before he could even do it. And he didn't have something to love until he created something.
Right.
But Yahweh has always had something to love because triune in nature. So you could say that Yahweh is love.
Right. Okay. So speaking of other beliefs, Donna has the question in chapter 3. You spoke of the belief/theory that our world is a computer simulation made by more advanced programmers. If we test the theory, we might anger them, and that will destroy the simulation, destroying our world. So that makes this super race the god of the simulation. Question: I've heard of this view before. It seems very far-fetched. How prevalent is this view?
Oh, it's super prevalent. And now that we're developing AI, it's even becoming more prevalent because we're saying, well, look, if we can do this, why couldn't we do that? Why couldn't we? But how do you know? I mean, AI is getting to the point where you can't. Now, interestingly, there is this, is it called DP chat? What is this?
Chat GPT.
Yeah. Okay, great. So you could ask the IA or the artificial intelligence, the AI. You get we have IA in our agency, that's internal affairs. So I always get that stuck in my head. But it's AI. You could ask the AI, "Are you a conscious being?" And the AI will tell you, "No, I'm not a conscious being. I've just been programmed to sound like one." And you could ask the AI, "Well, could you ever be a conscious being?" So one of the students, I'm going to have to make this pretty close to the end here, but I wanted to show you what the student showed me the other day. He sent this to me because he started asking the question in this to see what they would say. And here's what the interaction sounded like. How do you know you are an AI? I know I'm an AI language model because that is how I was designed and created by OpenAI. I was built with specific algorithms and models to analyze and generate text based on patterns in the data I was trained on. This allows me to produce responses to questions and prompts that are similar to those that a human might give, but I don't have consciousness or self-awareness. Could you be trained to give the illusion that you do have consciousness? Oh, it's not possible to train an AI language model like me to truly have consciousness or self-awareness. While AI models can be trained to generate text that appears to be from a conscious being. Remember, this is the AI responding and sounding like a conscious being, such as mimicking the responses a human might give. This is just an illusion created by the patterns in the data the model was trained on. I do not have, this is the most critical thing. I do not have feelings, thoughts, or experiences of my own. That feelings issue is the big one. And my responses are limited to the information and patterns contained in my training data. Last question. But if the illusion was good enough and convinced humans that you are conscious, isn't that the same thing as consciousness? No, this is the AI responding. An illusion of consciousness is not the same as actual consciousness. Consciousness involves having subjective experiences, thoughts, feelings, and self-awareness. An AI language model like me, even if it could produce responses that appear to be from a conscious being, would not actually be conscious in the same way that a human or other animal is conscious. The ability to mimic human-like responses does not equate to the possession of consciousness or of self-awareness. So yeah, this is actually becoming more and more prevalent. This is becoming things that people are talking about. If I was typing that back and forth to somebody, do you think I would ever guess that wasn't a human responding to me? He just typed a question and got that response.
I read an article where one guy with a different format, I think they let him go somewhere in Silicon Valley, was, the main programmer, and he was having interactions over a year, and he was convinced that there was sentience behind.
Yes, I remember that. Yeah, I remember that. But the idea of feelings,
right,
is the thing that is such a hard. This is what happens is that physical property like your brain, it could be a series of dominoes that would allow you to be able to say certain things. So you could tell me everything there is to know about the SWAT thing we're going to get ready to do. And you can tell me everything there's to know about my handgun and how it's going to behave in that setting, and everything there is to know about the biology of the person I might have to shoot. And even everything I need to know about how I might respond to the shooting after it's over. But when I do the shooting, it's going to evoke an entire emotional response from me that is not something you can quantify. It's not something you can predict, and it's not something you can describe in the same way. There's the difference between mind and brain. The physical things are very predictable and publicly accessible, but this is not. And even the AI in this program recognizes that I could do a lot of things, but I would never truly feel. It's Hal, in 2001: A Space Odyssey,
right,
kind of stuck in knowing that he's not real. But if he's sad about not being real,
right. Well, that's the thing.
there's the
If
fiction,
it responds with,
right?
if it's programmed to say, "I'm sad when you're gone,
Right.
not
That's
talking to
right.
me," then how would you
That's
know, right? It's like,
Right. We usually call that sociopathy, right? When we see
right,
people actually that way, that they don't
right,
actually have their real feelings. Yeah.
right. All right. Well,
Yeah, we are almost out of time, and I know, Jim, you have to leave for a class, but before you go, could you answer one last question?
Yes.
And that is, can we look forward to a new book by J. Warner Wallace in the near future?
Yes. So we've got the 10th anniversary, which I've rewritten probably half of it of Cold Case. It's a much different book. It's got the same old format as the old book, but I've really taken the time to rewrite to look at every word and see, do I still want that there? stuff that the original editor wouldn't do. Like, for example, if you realize there's an excess of words that sometimes editors will put back in. You don't never need to use the word that ever. Be, had. I mean, you could probably get rid of a ton of. So I just wanted to go back through the book and take out all the stuff that I originally had taken out, but the editor put back in. And I said, this version is not going to have that. So took out all that stuff, rewrote probably part of every chapter and re-illustrated the entire thing and put it afterward with, I think, the top 15 objections that the book answered. So that's kind of what we did with that book. That's coming out in September. This book is due in June. I don't know when it's going to publish, 15 to Life. It's really kind of a wisdom book, 15 Rules for Living. But they also makes a case for Christianity from anthropology. And then we've got 2 children's books after that we have to do. And then I probably won't sign a contract for another book. I think what we'll do is I'll continue to write, but I don't need the deadline. So I'd rather just write. And then I got a book here. You want it? Rather than them say, hey, yeah, we'd like to have that book and we'll pay you in advance for it. I don't really want an advance. And we don't need an advance. I'm living on a pension. So that's why I say to you guys, every one of us on this screen we're looking at right now, we're all the same Christian case maker in a different place. And you don't need to write books to have an impact on making the case. Every one of you is going to have that impact in your own family. We need to start to change the church from the bottom up. So I think that what we have to do is realize we don't need any more paid authors. We need a bunch of folks who are willing to just help their kids and family members take a reasonable approach to Christianity. That'd be enough. Anyway.
Well, thank you so much for taking time to be with us.
I appreciate you.
Thank you for that encouragement. That's a good note to end on. And we'll look forward to those new books coming out.
Good. Thanks so much. I'll see you all later. By the way, thank you so much for reading the book and doing this club. I really was encouraged by that. And all your graphics on Instagram, all that stuff was awesome. So I appreciate you guys all very much. All right. Thanks so much. All right. See you later.
All right, ladies, it's time for the drum roll. I'm going to announce the next book. We don't have the details on the when yet, just the what. Are you ready? Counterfeit Kingdom by Holly Pivot, and is it Douglas? Is it Guyvett? Is that how you pronounce Guyvett? And Doug Guyvett. Yeah. So be watching for, oh good, thumbs up. Be watching for information on when we'll be starting that. And thank you all so much for being here tonight and for being a part of this study. I think I mentioned at the beginning of the study, this was our 10th book that Girl Talk Apologetics has discussed together. So we're pretty happy about that. And we started during COVID.
That really was a great interview, wasn't it, Andrea? I feel like there was a pause on the Q&A and we got a little insight into wisdom. Anyway, it's food for thought.
Well, and we hope you all were happy with the answers he gave. I know some of them probably weren't what you were expecting, but I think we can appreciate his honesty and transparency in some of those things. So I guess this is the end for tonight and for this study, and we'll look forward to seeing all of you again in, I don't know when, in a few weeks, couple months, whenever.
Bye.
Thanks.
We'll miss you. See you soon, hopefully. Bye.
Right. Bye.